Before I tell you what happened inside that station, I need you to understand something first. Nancy Cooper did not run to the police because she was naive. She did not run there because she had forgotten what Richard was, or what he was capable of. She ran there because it was the only door left. And when you are out of doors, you stop asking which one is safe. You just run. That is what she knew. That is what he had taken from her. It was a Thursday evening. She was in their second-bedroom apartment, sitting on the edge of the bed with her coat still on because somewhere in her body, a part of her had already decided she was leaving. She just hadn't told the rest of herself yet. Her phone was in her hand. She was mid-message to her sister. "I think tonight is the night I finally..." She never finished it. Richard's hand came first, then the wall. Then the floor rushed up to meet her phone in a sound she will never forget, that specific, final crack of a screen that has been killed, not dropped. He didn't just take it from her. His hand closed around her wrist and twisted once, and the phone hit the floor, and then his foot came down on it, not in a stumble, with his full weight and full intention. And then he picked up what was left, and held it at shoulder height, and looked at her, and opened his hand, and let it fall again, slow, deliberate, so she would understand that what he was destroying was not the phone. She ran, didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't wait for the elevator. She hit the stairwell and lost a shoe on the second landing, and left it there without slowing. She ran with one shoe on. By the time she pushed through the glass doors of the 9th precinct, her chest was heaving and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The fluorescent lights inside were so bright they felt violent. She walked to the front desk and said the words she had been rehearsing in her head the entire 6 blocks over. "My ex-boyfriend just attacked me. He destroyed my phone. He said he was going to finish this tonight. I need help." The officer behind the desk looked at her the way people look at a problem they've already decided is not their problem. He told her to take a seat. She sat. She sat at a cold metal table, with the shattered pieces of her phone laid out in front of her like evidence nobody was collecting. She sat while officers moved around her with the specific slowness of men who have been told to slow down. She sat while the desk sergeant, a broad man in a Navy patrol jacket and a perfectly knotted tie, stood just far enough behind her to be watching, but not close enough to look like he was watching. She didn't know he was already typing. She didn't know that somewhere across the city, Richard's phone was lighting up with her exact location. She buried her face in her hands, and that was the moment the air in the room changed. She didn't hear the door open. She heard it close. One sound. Quiet. Controlled. The kind of control that is louder than chaos. Click. She lifted her head. At the far end of the precinct, near the heavy glass entrance doors, a man in a dark fitted jacket stood with his right hand wrapped around the door handle, not rushing, not hiding. A dark tattoo climbed the side of his neck like a signature. His jaw was set. His eyes swept the room once, not frantically, the way people look when they are searching, but slowly, the way people look when they already know exactly what they came to find. He turned the lock. The desk sergeant's voice cracked from somewhere behind her. "Hey, sir, you can't." The man did not turn around. He just moved to the second door. Same hand, same quiet certainty. Click. The whole room stopped breathing. And Nancy Cooper, who had run 6 blocks in one shoe, who had laid the broken pieces of her life out on a metal table and begged a corrupt system to care, felt something shift inside the precinct that had nothing to do with fear. The police were no longer in charge. Guanin had just locked the doors. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. 1 hour before the doors locked, Nancy was standing in the second bedroom of the apartment she had been trying to leave for 8 months. Not trying the way people try when they are undecided, trying the way people try when every exit keeps closing before they reach it. She had tried in February, when she packed a bag while Richard was at work and made it as far as the parking garage before he pulled in. She had tried in April, when she called the hotline from the bathroom with the shower running, and the woman on the other end gave her a list of steps, and she wrote all of them down, and Richard found the paper 3 days later folded inside her jacket pocket. She was still trying. Tonight, her coat was already on. The decision had been building in her chest all day like pressure behind a sealed door, and by the time she got home from work and heard his keys in the lock, something in her had already gone quiet. Not the scared kind of quiet. The kind that comes after scared, when your body has stopped arguing with itself and simply started calculating. She was in the second bedroom, because that was the room with the window that faced the fire escape. She told herself she was looking for her charger. She had been telling herself that for 6 minutes. Her phone was in her hand. She was typing to her sister. "I think tonight is the night I finally—" She heard him before she saw him. His footsteps down the hallway had a specific weight when something was wrong. She had learned to read his footsteps, the same way sailors learn to read water, not because they wanted to, but because the cost of misreading was too high. Tonight the weight was different, low and deliberate. The kind that meant he had already made a decision and was walking toward it. The door swung open. He looked at the coat first, then at the phone in her hand. Richard was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the particular posture of someone who had never once in his life been told no and believed it. He had a face that photographed as handsome she had loved that face once, before she learned what lived behind it. Right now that face was very still. He said, "Where are you going, Nancy?" She said, "Nowhere. I was just—" He crossed the room in 4 steps. She didn't have time to pocket the phone. His hand closed around her wrist and twisted once, the way you'd wring a cloth, and the phone hit the floor. Then his foot came down on it, not accidentally, not in a stumble, but with his full weight and full intention, and that crack, that flat terminal crack of the screen shattering under his heel, landed somewhere in her chest. He picked up what was left and held it at shoulder height, and looked at her, and opened his hand, and let it fall again. Slow, deliberate, so she would understand that what he was destroying was not the phone. "You're not going anywhere," he said. She believed him. She had believed him for a long time. But then he turned to reach for his own phone on the dresser, and for 1/2 second his back was to her, and the bedroom door was open behind her, and some ancient, animal part of her brain fired before the rest of her could debate it. She ran, down the hallway, past the kitchen. Her shoulder caught the doorframe of the front door, and she spun through it anyway, into the building corridor, and then she was at the stairwell and going down, and she lost a shoe on the second landing, and left it there without slowing. She heard him shout her name from somewhere above her. The sound bounced off the concrete walls of the stairwell and chased her all the way to the lobby. She hit the street. The air was cold, the specific, sharp cold of a city night that doesn't care about you at all, and she ran 6 blocks without looking behind her once. Not because she was brave, because she was afraid if she looked back she would stop running. The 9th precinct was on the corner of a street she had walked past 50 times without ever needing it. The lights inside were blazing. Through the glass doors she could see the front desk and the movement of officers and the blue and white of the whole system that was supposed to exist for exactly this moment. She pushed through the doors. She walked to the front desk and she said the words, "My ex-boyfriend just attacked me. He destroyed my phone. He said he was going to finish this tonight. I need help." The officer behind the desk had a thick neck and tired eyes, and the manner of a man who had worked too many Thursday evenings to be moved by them. He looked at her the way you look at a cracked sidewalk, aware of it, noting it, fully intending to keep walking. He said, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to take a seat while I get someone to take your statement." She said, "He knows where I live. He's going to come here." The officer said, "Ma'am, take a seat." She took a seat. The chair was metal and cold and bolted to the floor, which felt like a specific kind of message. The table in front of her was the same, bolted, immovable, stained with the particular grayness of a surface that had absorbed years of bad news. She set the broken pieces of her phone on the table. The screen was splintered in a sunburst pattern from the center, and the back had cracked clean across. She arranged the pieces without thinking about it, the way you arrange things when your hands need something to do while your mind is barely holding itself together. Around her, the precinct moved at a pace that had nothing to do with urgency. An officer crossed the room carrying a paper cup. 2 others talked by the filing cabinets, one of them laughing at something, the laugh bouncing off the fluorescent-lit ceiling. A phone rang at the far end of the room, and rang, and nobody picked it up. The desk sergeant, the broad man in the Navy patrol jacket who had told her to sit, was back behind his station. She had assumed he was processing something, doing something, beginning the sequence of events that would eventually result in someone taking her seriously. She was watching him when she saw it. His eyes were down, but not on paperwork. His thumbs were moving. He was typing. She watched his face as he did it, the focused, private expression of someone composing a message they didn't want anyone to see. He glanced up once, caught her looking, and his expression rearranged itself into something professionally neutral. He set the phone face down beside the keyboard. "Someone'll be right with you," he said. She nodded. She turned back to the table. But something had shifted behind her sternum, a slow, cold recognition settling in like water finding a crack. She thought about the way he had looked at her when she first walked in. Not at her face, at her phone, at the broken pieces she was carrying, and then the way his hands had moved not toward a form or a keyboard, but toward his personal phone, the one now face down on the desk. She thought about who Richard knew. She thought about what Richard paid for, and who he paid, and how far that money reached. She looked at the exits. The front doors were glass and automatic and opened onto the street. There was a corridor to her left that led somewhere deeper into the building. There was a side door near the filing cabinets that was currently closed. She was doing the math of it, calculating distance and speed, and what she was wearing on her feet when the room went quiet, and she turned, and the man in the dark jacket was already locking the second door. He turned then, for the first time, and faced the room. "Radios," he said. "Quiet." Not loud, he didn't need loud. The word landed in the silence the way a stone lands in still water. All of them, on the table. Now, nobody moved. He didn't repeat himself. He just waited, and the waiting had a quality to it that was worse than any raised voice. One of the officers younger, closer to the side wall, slowly unclipped the radio from his shoulder and set it on the nearest desk. The sound of it made the decision for the others. One by one, like dominoes considering their options and deciding against them, the radios came off. "Sidearms," he said next. "Same register, same stillness, on the same table. Slow. Now, you listen here," the desk sergeant started. One of the men who had entered behind the man in the dark jacket because there were others, Nancy realized now. Two of them who had come in quietly and positioned themselves at the edges of the room while everyone was focused on the doors, stepped forward from the shadow near the corridor and said nothing. Just stepped forward. That was enough. The sidearms went on the table. The desk sergeant's face had gone through several colors in the space of 60 seconds and had arrived at something between gray and pale. His mouth was open. He looked like a man who had just watched something he had always dismissed as theoretical become very, very real. Nancy sat completely still at the metal table. Her hands were in her lap. Her broken phone was still in front of her. She understood, in a way that bypassed thought and went directly to instinct, that she was safer in this moment than she had been since she walked through the door. She did not know why. She did not know who this man was. She just knew it. He crossed the room toward her. He walked the way powerful men walk when they have nothing to prove. Not fast, not slow, just direct. Each step landing with the certainty of someone who has already decided where he is going and is simply completing the journey. He pulled out the chair across from her, the one the officers had never bothered to sit in, and he sat down. Up close, the tattoo on his neck was more complex than she had realized, geometric shapes interlocking with what looked like old text in a language she didn't recognize, the lines sharp and unblurred. The ink deeply settled. It was not a young man's tattoo. It had been earned over time. He looked at the broken phone on the table. Then he looked at her. "Nancy Cooper," he said. Not a question. She didn't answer immediately. "Who are you?" "My name is Guanin." He folded his hands on the table. His knuckles were scarred in the specific way that knuckles scar when they have met resistance repeatedly over many years. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you decide how to feel about it. Can you do that?" She looked at him, at the tattoo, at the men stationed at the edges of the room, at the locked doors and the pile of surrendered weapons on the desk that used to belong to the officers who were supposed to protect her. She said, "Okay." He said, Richard Voss has been operating in this city for 4 years. You know what he does to people. You know it personally. He let that sit for exactly 1 second, not longer. What you don't know is that for the last 18 months, his operations have been overlapping with mine. Supply chains, territory, money that moves through channels he has no business touching. He paused. I am not a patient man by nature, but I am a thorough one. I don't move until I know everything. I've been watching Richard for a long time, Nancy said. Why are you telling me this? Because you walked into this building tonight and gave me a reason to move. He glanced briefly toward the desk sergeant, then back to her. This precinct specifically. This one has been on Richard's payroll for 2 years. The sergeant behind that desk has been forwarding him information since before you sat down. The captain of this precinct takes a monthly deposit that clears through 3 shell accounts. He said it the way you'd read a grocery list. You were never safe in this building. You walked into a trap that was already set. The cold feeling she had felt when she watched the desk sergeant typing that slow, seeping recognition confirmed itself now, with a finality that made her stomach drop. She thought about the way the officer at the front desk had barely looked at her. She thought about the phone calls that didn't get made, the forms that never appeared, the particular texture of the precinct's indifference. She had read it as bureaucracy. She had read it wrong. He already knows I'm here, she said. He has known since approximately 4 minutes after you sat down. Guanin's voice didn't change. He is on his way. She looked at the doors. Locked. Then at the man across from her. Then why did you lock us in? She said. If he's coming. Because the doors are not for him. He held her gaze. The doors are for them. He tilted his head, almost imperceptibly, toward the officers standing against the wall. I needed to make sure no one in this room could make a call, or send a message, or disappear before Richard arrives, and finds out that the advantage he was counting on no longer exists. She stared at him. You're not trying to keep him out, she said slowly. No, Guanin said. I'm making sure that when he comes through those doors, he walks directly into something he is completely unprepared for. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Somewhere across the room, one of the officers shifted his weight, and the floor creaked, and one of Guanin's men turned his head, and the officer went still again. Nancy looked down at the broken phone on the table. The sunburst crack across the screen, the clean break across the back. She said, And me? He said, You're the reason this ends tonight instead of next month. He stood then, and he turned toward the desk sergeant. The sergeant had been inching, not literally, but in the slow, millimeter way of a man calculating whether there was still a version of this situation in which he came out on the other side professionally intact. He had stationed himself behind his desk with the posture of a man who believed that the desk itself might constitute a form of protection. His wide eyes tracked Guanin across the room, with the expression of someone watching a weather system move toward them. Guanin stopped in front of the desk. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for anything. He simply stood there on the other side of the counter and looked at the sergeant with an expression that had no anger in it at all, and that absence of anger was somehow the most frightening thing in the room. You sent him a message when she sat down, Guanin said. The sergeant said, I don't know what you're talking about. Guanin reached across the desk and picked up the phone that was lying face down beside the keyboard. He turned it over. The screen was still lit. He looked at it for a moment, then set it down facing the sergeant so the sergeant could see what was on it. The sergeant's jaw tightened. The message was sent at 8:47, Guanin said. Richard's first reply came at 8:49. Your second message, with the specific table she was sitting at, went out at 8:51. He pulled out a phone of his own slim, dark, different from the sergeant's, and laid it beside the sergeant's so both screens were visible. I have been monitoring Richard's communication lines for 11 months. Every message he sends and receives. I watched your conversation happen in real time, from a car 2 blocks away. The sergeant opened his mouth, closed it. I want to hear you say it, out loud, so this room, every person in it understands exactly what kind of night this is, and because she deserves to hear you admit what you did. He did not look at Nancy when he said it. He didn't need to. She came here for help and you handed her to him. Say that. The sergeant looked at Nancy. Something moved across his face, not quite guilt, not quite shame, something uglier and more complicated than either of those. The look of a man who had made a series of small compromises over a long period of time and had never properly faced the accumulation. He said nothing. Guanin leaned forward on the counter, his weight shifting onto both forearms, bringing his face level with the sergeant's. His voice dropped low enough that only the three of them could hear it. "He is going to arrive at this building very shortly. Minutes, not more," he said. "He is going to come in here expecting to collect her from officers who are on his side. That is what you told him he would find." He let a pause land. "What he is going to find is considerably different, and when that happens, I need every officer in this room to understand clearly and fully that the version of tonight in which they survive intact is the one where they do not try to help him." He straightened up. "So I'm going to ask you one more time. Tell her what you did, so everyone in this room is aligned on exactly what kind of night this is." The sergeant's hands were flat on the desk. They were shaking slightly, though Nancy could see him trying to stop them. He looked at her. He said, "I told him you were here." His voice was rough, stripped of its professional flatness. "I told him which table you were at. He has an arrangement with the captain. I was following protocol." "Whose protocol?" Guanin said. The sergeant said nothing. "Say it." "Richard's," the sergeant said, quiet, almost a whisper. "Richard's protocol." The word dropped into the room like a weight hitting concrete, and in the silence that followed, Nancy could hear from somewhere outside, still distant but getting less distant, the sound of cars. More than one. Guanin heard it too. He turned from the desk and looked toward the locked glass doors at the front of the precinct. Through them, the street was still empty, but the sound of engines was unmistakable now, deliberate, unhurried. He had known they were coming. He had planned for them to come. He had built this entire night around this exact moment. He turned back to the room. "He's here," he said. The next 5 minutes moved the way things move when someone who has done this before is in charge, not frantically, but with the compressed efficiency of a plan that had been rehearsed somewhere other than this room. Guanin said 4 words to the 2 men stationed at the edges of the precinct. Nancy didn't catch all of them. She caught the tone, which was the same tone he used for everything low, level, carrying the specific authority of someone who has never once needed to repeat himself. The 2 men moved immediately. One went to the corridor on the left. The other crossed to the communications console at the far side of the room, the bank of monitors and dispatch equipment that ran the precinct's internal network, and began working through it with the focused quiet of someone who had been in rooms like this before and knew exactly which wires mattered. The radios on the table stayed off. The overhead scanner, which had been murmuring a low stream of city dispatch traffic since Nancy arrived, cut to silence. The precinct, which had been humming with the ambient noise of an institution in operation, went still. Not the still of things winding down, the still of things being deliberately sealed. The officers were grouped near the far wall now. There were 4 of them, not counting the desk sergeant, and they stood with the specific posture of men who had been relieved of their weapons and had not yet finished processing what that meant for them. One of them, the young one who had been first to surrender his radio, kept looking at the locked front doors with an expression that cycled between calculation and resignation. The others looked mostly at the floor. Guanin came back to Nancy's table. He set both hands on the surface and looked at her directly. There was nothing performative in the way he did it, no attempt to soften what he was about to say, no warmth added to make it easier to hear, just a straight line between what needed to be communicated and the person who needed to receive it. "In a few minutes," he said, "Richard is going to come through the front of this building. When that happens, this room becomes a confined space with a man who has armed backup outside that he will not be able to reach. That is by design." He paused. "I am telling you now before it starts, because I need you to have made a decision before the doors open. Not in the middle of it." She looked at him. "What kind of decision?" "There is a back office down that corridor." He tilted his head toward the hallway on the left. "It has 1 door, no windows facing the street, and my man is already inside it. You go there, you close the door, you wait. When it's over, I'll come to you." And the other option? Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, but the slight recalibration of a man who had expected the question less quickly. You stay, he said. Here? In this room? At this table, where Richard will see you the moment he walks in. He said it plainly, without pressure in either direction. He expects to find you here, frightened, waiting for the officers he thinks are going to hand you over. If you're gone, he recalculates. He gets careful. He paused. If you're here, he walks straight into the center of what I've built. No recalculation, no caution. He sees you, and he stops thinking. Nancy looked down at the broken phone on the table. She thought about the parking garage in February, the folded paper in her jacket pocket in April, the way she had stood in the second bedroom tonight with her coat already on, running the math of an escape she hadn't yet committed to, all the versions of leaving that had closed before she reached them. She thought about the desk sergeant saying Richard's protocol in that stripped, quiet voice. She looked up. I'll stay, she said. Guanin looked at her for a moment. Not with admiration, he wasn't that kind of man. Just with the steady acknowledgement of someone who has asked a serious question and received a serious answer. He nodded once. He turned back to the room. She watched him work. Not the dramatic work of movies, no weapons being assembled on tables, no maps being unrolled. The work was quieter and more unsettling than that. It was positioning, angles, the careful, unhurried rearrangement of people and sightlines in a room that Richard would walk into believing he already understood. One of Guanin's men took up a position inside the corridor, visible from the main room if you knew where to look, invisible if you didn't. The other one finished at the communications console and moved to a chair near the back wall, where he picked up a clipboard from a nearby desk and sat down with it in a posture so casually professional that from a distance he could pass for a detective reviewing case notes. The surrendered weapons on the table were moved. Nancy didn't see where exactly, only that they were gone. The officers remained along the far wall. Guanin spoke to them once, briefly, standing close enough that his voice didn't carry to Nancy. Whatever he said, it produced the specific stillness of people who have been clearly informed of their options and have chosen the one that keeps them breathing. The desk sergeant sat back at his station. Not because Guanin had told him to act normal, he hadn't said that. At least, not that Nancy heard. But because the desk was the only place in the room that still felt like it belonged to him, and people, when everything is stripped away, move toward the last thing that feels like theirs. Guanin came back and sat across from Nancy again. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set a small black device on the table between them. It was rectangular, slightly larger than a USB drive, with a single indicator light on one end. The light was red. This has been recording since before you arrived, he said. I had a man in this precinct at 5 this evening, the captain's office. He did not elaborate on how. Every conversation that happened in this building tonight is on here. The sergeant's calls. The dispatch override that cleared all units from this block 40 minutes ago, which you may not have noticed, but the street outside has been empty since you arrived. He glanced at the device. When the time comes, this goes into the precinct's PA console. Every officer in this building, every one of Richard's men outside, will hear exactly what was said and who said it. Nancy stared at the device. You planned all of this before I even got here. I planned for several versions of tonight, he said. This is one of them. She wanted to ask him what the other versions looked like. She decided she didn't need to know. From outside sooner than she had fully prepared herself, for she heard the sound of vehicles slowing, more than 2. The particular deceleration of cars that are stopping with intention, not at a traffic light. Guanin heard it. He didn't look toward the doors. He looked at her. Remember, he said quietly. You are exactly where you're supposed to be. She put her hands flat on the table in front of her. She kept her eyes forward. She breathed. Richard's voice came before he did. She could hear him outside the glass, not his words, not yet, but the register of him. That particular carrying confidence of a man who had never in his life approached a room and wondered whether it would let him in. He was talking to someone, giving instructions. The tone of a man distributing tasks to people he was entirely certain would complete them. Then his shape appeared behind the glass doors. He was wearing a dark overcoat, charcoal gray, well cut. His hair was the way it always was, controlled, deliberate. Behind him, she could make out other shapes. 2 or 3 men hanging back on the steps in the way that security hangs back, present but not leading. They were his, not Richard's idea of intimidation. Richard's idea of intimidation was himself. He tried the door. It didn't move. He tried it again with more pressure, and then he stepped back and looked at the lock mechanism through the glass, with the expression of a man who has encountered a minor inconvenience and is deciding how much to let it irritate him. He knocked, not politely. 3 solid impacts, the knock of someone who expects the door to open simply because he is the one knocking. Inside the precinct, nobody moved. Guanin was standing now, back from the center of the room, positioned at an angle that would not be immediately visible from the front doors. His arms were at his sides. His face was arranged in the particular expression Nancy had noticed when he first walked in, not threatening, not tense, just permanently settled, like a man who has been through worse than this specific moment and knows it. The desk sergeant sat at his station. He looked at Guanin. Guanin said, quietly, "Buzz him in." The sergeant's jaw moved. He said, "Just him?" Or, "Just him," Guanin said. "Tell him the outer door is malfunctioning. Tell him he needs to come in alone to get it reset from inside." The sergeant picked up the desk intercom. His hand was steady enough. His voice, when it came out of the exterior speaker, was professionally flat, the practiced neutrality of a man who had been performing this role for years and could still find the register even now. "Mr. Voss, we've got a door mechanism issue. Need you to come in solo so we can reset it from the interior panel. Your men can wait outside." A pause from beyond the glass. Then Richard's voice, muffled by the door. "What kind of amateur operation?" "Standard procedure, sir. Won't take a minute." Another pause. She could see him weighing it behind the glass, looking at the desk sergeant through the door, running whatever calculations Richard ran. He was a careful man in the ways that careful men who have never truly been challenged are careful, thorough about the details, but constitutionally incapable of imagining that the room itself might be the threat. He said something to the men behind him. They stepped back. He came in alone. The door swung open, and the air pressure in the room shifted, and Richard Voss walked into the 9th precinct, and for the first half-second, everything was exactly as he expected it to be. He saw Nancy. That was the first thing. The way Guanin had predicted, his eyes went directly to her, pulled there by whatever long-established gravity exists between an abuser and the person he has decided belongs to him. She was at the metal table, hands flat in front of her, and she did not look away when his eyes found her. That surprised him. She saw it surprise him, the slight tightening around his eyes, the fractional pause in his movement. Then his gaze moved, and he saw the officers along the far wall, standing, unmanned, not positioned the way officers are positioned in a working precinct. He saw the desk sergeant, and something in the sergeant's face told him what his face always told people who could read him, that he was not in control of the room he was sitting in. He saw the communications console, dark and silent, and then he completed his turn, and he saw Guanin. There are moments when recognition changes a person's face at a speed that bypasses all their training and composure. Richard's face did that now. Not fear, not yet. Not Richard, not right away. Something more complex and more telling than fear. The specific expression of a man who has been operating in a world where certain names exist as abstract information, understood but distant, and who has just turned around and found one of those names standing 6 feet away from him inside a locked room. "You know who I am," Guanin said. "Not a question." Richard said, "What is this?" "A conversation we should have had several months ago," Guanin said. He moved forward, unhurried, into the center of the room. "You've been running operations through the waterfront district, the container transit, the laundering through the Meridian accounts." He said each item the way you'd itemize a receipt, clearly, without emphasis, because the facts themselves were sufficient. "Those are my channels. That has been my territory for 11 years. Richard's posture changed. Not breaking Richard didn't break easily. She knew that, but recalibrating, looking for the seams of this situation, the places where leverage might still exist. His eyes moved to the front doors. They were locked. His men were outside. Between them and him was a door that had been closed and bolted from the inside, and through the glass he could see 2 of his men on the steps, waiting in the easy posture of people who had no idea they were already outside the perimeter of a trap that had closed behind their employer. He looked at the desk sergeant. "Open the doors." The sergeant didn't move. I said open. "He won't," Guanin said. "None of them will. You've been operating in this precinct like it's a resource you own. Tonight it isn't." He stopped moving. "Tonight it's a room where you're going to stand still and listen to something." Richard turned fully toward him then. And Nancy, watching from the table, saw the thing that Richard did when he had decided that the situation called for force rather than calculation, that specific, interior gathering, the way his shoulders drew back and his chin came up and his hands opened at his sides. She had seen it in the second bedroom. She had seen it in the car, in the kitchen, in the hallway of an apartment she had stopped thinking of as home long before she left it. She knew what came after that gathering. She stood up. She wasn't sure, afterward, why she stood. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something Guanin had instructed. Something in her body simply refused. In the moment that Richard began to gather himself, to remain seated. Seated was how he had always found her. Seated, or backed against a wall, or already moving away from him. She stood up and she faced him across the room, and she did not take a step back. Richard looked at her. Something moved across his face that she had never seen there before. Something that took her a moment to name. Uncertainty. Richard moved toward her anyway. Because that was Richard, the uncertainty was real. But it wasn't yet stronger than the habit of 22 months of going toward her when she was the closest available target. He crossed the bullpen in 5 steps. His attention narrowed to her in the way that attention narrows right before it becomes something physical. And Nancy held her ground and did not move, and felt her hands shaking, and stood there anyway. He got within arm's reach. Guanin's hand closed on his collar from behind, not a grab, not a struggle, just a single, clean application of force that stopped Richard's momentum as completely as a wall. Richard turned, twisting against the grip, and Guanin stepped once to the side and redirected the turn into the nearest desk, and Richard hit the edge of it hard enough to knock the breath out of him and stayed there, one hand on the desk surface, breathing. It was not a long sequence. It was not dramatic. It was the movement of someone who has done this so many times that violence has become economical for them, the minimum necessary, applied with precision, producing the desired result. Richard straightened. His composure was reassembling itself in real time, that careful reconstruction of authority that men like him always attempt when the physical moment has passed. He looked at Guanin, then at the officers, then at the doors. He said, "You have no idea what you're doing." Guanin walked to the communications console. He picked up the small black recording device from where it had been set beside the panel. He plugged it into the input port on the PA board, and Nancy watched his hands work with the quick certainty of someone who had identified this exact port on this exact model of equipment in advance. He looked up at the room once, the officers against the wall, the desk sergeant, Richard, still braced against the desk with his hand flat on the surface and his breathing returning to normal. He pressed play. The voice that came out of the precinct speakers was the captain's. She had never heard the captain speak, but everyone else in the room clearly had, because she saw it in their faces, the specific flinch of people hearing a familiar voice say things it was never supposed to say out loud. The recording was clear. Not perfect, there was the ambient texture of a room being captured by a hidden device, but clear enough. Clear enough for the words to land without ambiguity. The captain's voice talked about amounts, about schedules, about the specific language of a man who has been paid for long enough that the payment has become normalized, converted from corruption into something that sounds, in his own telling, like professional arrangement. He said Richard's name 4 times. He referenced the desk sergeant by rank. He listed, with the casual specificity of a man who no longer considers the weight of what he's saying, the precise nature of the service being rendered, and what it cost. The recording ran for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. In the room, nobody spoke. One of the officers along the far wall, not the young one, one of the others, a heavy-set man in his 40s, who had been staring at the floor since his weapon went on the table, slowly sat down on the nearest bench. Not dramatically, just the movement of a man whose legs had quietly informed him they were done holding him up. Richard was very still. The calculation behind his eyes was visible if you knew how to look for it, and Nancy had spent almost 2 years learning how to look for it. She could see him running the numbers, the reach of this recording, the number of people in this room who had now heard it, the question of whether there was still a version of tonight that he could manage and contain. She could see him arrive, one by one, at the conclusion that the answer to each calculation was no. His hands, which had been flat on the desk surface, curled slowly inward. He looked at Nancy. "This isn't over," he said. Low, just for her. The private register he used when he wanted something to land without witnesses, even in a room full of them. She had heard that voice in the second bedroom, in the parking garage, in the kitchen with the door closed. She had heard it so many times that her body had learned to respond to it the way it responds to cold, a contracting, an internal bracing, a making small of oneself that she had never consciously chosen and had never been able to simply decide to stop. She felt it begin, the old familiar contracting, and then she felt something else rise up behind it, something that had been building since she stood up from the metal table and didn't step back. Something that had been building, if she was being precise about it, since February, since April, since every door that had closed before she reached it, and every version of leaving that hadn't worked. And the accumulation of all of it arrived now, in a way that was not loud and not dramatic, and did not feel the way she had always thought standing up for yourself was supposed to feel. It felt like being very tired and very clear at the same time. She said, "Yes, it is." 2 words. Quiet. Direct. Returned to him in the same private register he had used, so that only the 2 of them heard them. She saw his face register. It saw the uncertainty come back, stronger this time, and stay. Guanin stepped forward. He took Richard's arm at the elbow, not roughly, with the professional firmness of someone completing a task, and turned him toward the far wall where the officers were standing. Richard went not willingly, but without the resources for another physical attempt, surrounded on all sides by a room that had stopped belonging to him the moment the first door was locked. They heard the other cars 12 minutes later. Different from Richard's cars. These came in faster, less organized, the sound of institutions responding rather than individuals arriving. Through the glass front doors, Nancy could see the flicker of lights, blue and white and red, the specific rotating pattern of vehicles that were not Richard's. Real ones, uncorrupted ones. Someone had made a call she wasn't aware of, at some point in the last hour, to someone outside Richard's reach. She looked at Guanin. He was already moving. Not rushing, he didn't rush. She had established that about him, but moving with the same directional certainty that had characterized everything he'd done since he walked through the front doors and locked them. He crossed to the communications console and retrieved the recording device and put it in his jacket pocket. He said something to the man near the corridor, who nodded and moved deeper into the building. He said something to the second man, who straightened from his chair and followed. He stopped at the table where Nancy was standing. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him. She thought about everything she had watched him do in the last hour, the locked doors, the surrendered weapons, the desk sergeant's forced confession, the recording playing over the PA, Richard's arm in his grip. She thought about what he had told her when she first sat down. "I am not a patient man by nature, but I am a thorough one." She thought about the fact that he had done all of this, all of it, from the monitoring to the planning to the timing of his arrival, not to save her. Exactly. But to settle a territorial account with Richard, and that she had been the catalyst rather than the cause. She understood the distinction. She didn't hold it against him. "You're leaving," she said. "Before they come through," he said. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. She nodded. He looked at her with that same steady, assessing directness that he had used since he first sat across from her. Then he said, "You stood up," she said. "Yes," he said. "Good," in a voice that was not warm and not effusive and was somehow, precisely because of that, the version of the word she needed to hear. Then he walked to the corridor and he was gone. The front doors opened 40 seconds later. Not by anyone inside unlocking them. Guanin's departure had been through a route she hadn't tracked, somewhere at the back of the building, a route that had clearly been identified and confirmed before tonight. The front doors opened because the officers coming through them had the override, the master authorization that sat above the building's secondary locks, and they used it. They came in fast and loud and calling out the way law enforcement enters rooms they don't yet understand volume and authority as a substitute for information, filling the space with the sound of command while they gathered the data of what they'd walked into. She counted 6 of them in the first 10 seconds, more behind. Richard was standing against the far wall. The corrupt officers were where they had been. The desk sergeant hadn't moved from his station. The room had the specific arrested quality of a tableau that has been waiting for an audience, everything in the position it had arrived at through the last hour's events, preserved for exactly this inspection. One of the incoming officers, a woman, plainclothes, the particular composed urgency of a detective rather than a patrol officer, crossed the room to Nancy first. She identified herself. She asked Nancy if she was injured. Nancy said she wasn't. The detective looked at the broken phone on the table. She looked at Richard against the far wall. She looked at the surrendered weapons laid out on the table. Guanin's men had returned them before they slipped out, she realized, leaving the room arranged as evidence rather than concealment. She took in the room with the methodical scan of someone building an understanding from evidence. She said, "Can you tell me what happened here?" Nancy thought about where to start. She thought about the second bedroom and the coat she had been wearing and the message to her sister she hadn't finished. She thought about 6 blocks in one shoe and the front desk officer's tired eyes and the desk sergeant's thumbs moving over his phone. She thought about the click of the deadbolt, the radios on the table, the recording playing over the PA system in the voice of a captain who had normalized his own corruption. She thought about standing up from the metal table and not stepping back. She said, "I came here for help. Someone came in and made sure I got it." The detective looked at her carefully. "Who?" Nancy looked at the locked corridor where Guanin had disappeared. Then at the front doors, which were open now, morning light beginning to come through them, thin and gray and new. The specific light of a city that has been running all night and is only now beginning to consider the possibility of day. "I don't know his name," she said. It was the first lie she had told since she walked through the door. It was also, she thought, the only debt she owed him, not out of loyalty and not out of fear, but because some debts are settled in the currency of silence and both parties understand the exchange without discussing it. The detective wrote something in her notebook. Around the room, Richard was being cuffed. The desk sergeant was being separated from his station by an officer who spoke to him in the flat, procedural tones of someone who has read the situation and already knows where it ends. The other officers were being individually addressed, each one getting a version of the same conversation, none of them looking at each other. The room was being dismantled. Not the room itself, the arrangement that had made the room what it had been for 2 years. The structure of it. The invisible architecture of who was paid and what was promised, and who would look the other way when the right man walked through the door. Nancy picked up the broken phone from the table. She held it in both hands for a moment, the cracked screen, the split back, the weight of something that was finished. Then she set it back down. She didn't need to carry it out with her. She walked to the front doors. The morning hit her first, the cold, and then the light, and then the smell of a city street after a night that had been too long and too much and was finally, with the particular relief of things that end without killing you, over. She stood on the top step and she breathed it in, and she didn't look back through the glass at the room she had just walked out of. Behind her, she could hear the precinct voices, movement, the specific controlled chaos of an institution being held accountable. In front of her, the street. She had come here in one shoe, running. She stood here now in both, standing still, and for the first time in 8 months the ground beneath her felt like something that was simply the ground, not a surface she was crossing toward the next threat. Not a distance she was calculating between herself and something she was afraid of, just the ground. She took one step, then another. She walked into the morning and she did not stop. Can Nancy tell the difference between a system that was built to protect her and one that was built to destroy her, and does Guanin walk away clean? Or does the morning light expose secrets even he didn't plan for? Subscribe and turn on notifications because you do not want to miss what this story becomes next. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think justice is truly served when the man who delivered it was never supposed to be there in the first place? Like this, if you are completely locked into this story and need to know what happens when the doors open again. The next chapter is coming, and trust me, you are not ready for what Richard left behind before he walked into that trap. See you in the next one, if Nancy's freedom holds.